Hi folks, I'm Pamela Young and this is Thrive 2030 brought to you by growthcurv. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Brett O'Reilly, who is the CEO of the Employers and Manufacturers Association in New Zealand. Welcome Brett, how are you today?
Good, thank you. Kia ora tatou, Pamela.
And kia ora to you too. Thanks so much for giving us the time today. Now, Brett, I know that you started your career way back in the early days with technology companies like telecom and networks and mobile companies. So you've come into this role through that sort of technology sector, which I think is a really valuable thing for people to know who are listening today. And before this role, you were the chief executive of APEC, which for those who don't know stands for Auckland Tourism Events and Economic Development. So you've had two roles now outside of the technology sector, which have put you right in the middle of what's going on in New Zealand in terms of business, enterprise, foreign export trade, and it gives you the opportunity to get up close and personal with a lot of very important people across business and government. So I'd like to start today by asking you to comment on something that I picked up when I was in Malaysia recently. I went there not so long ago, a couple of months back, to run the New Zealand ASEAN Business Council's annual conference as the moderator. I spoke with Susie Futrell while I was there. She's the Malaysia and Thailand Trade Commissioner. She said, Pamela, people don't want to come from New Zealand. She was, her message was that in her time up there, she'd found that a lot of New Zealand businesses just didn't see the opportunity or had the motivation to come to Asia and look for expansion opportunities. What do you think about that?
Look, I think that's, if Susie says it, I'm sure it's right. I think Southeast Asia is poorly understood by New Zealand businesses. I did my first trade mission there in 1985, and I think we tend to see it as sort of a homogeneous region when it's not. The economies are very different, and I don't think there's a strong understanding about how those different economies work. And yet, some of the fastest growing economies in the world are located in Southeast Asia, or ASEAN, if you want to use that term.
So what is it do you think that is in the New Zealand business culture that makes people complacent and not feel that they should go up there to see what the opportunities are?
Look, I think probably comes down to that lack of understanding, and also I think a lot of New Zealand businesses tend to be led by where the government focuses on. Clearly, there's always been a strong focus on Australia. That goes back to the 1980s with CER. There's been a big focus on China through the free trade agreement. A lot of tech companies are focused on Australia and the US. That's because they see Silicon Valley and an exit in the US is probably logical. So I guess there isn't just quite the same compelling proposition around that. I can remember when Gecko, a New Zealand technology company, first went up and based themselves in Singapore, and it was quite a unique thing, but they had done a analysis of what sort of international environment they wanted to go into for their particular sort of SaaS business, and they chose Singapore, and they've done very, very well out of that market. So I think it's just requires a bit more promotion and a bit more focus.
I wonder if that's it. I mean, at the same conference, I also spoke with James Robertson, who is the Fonterra representative for China. He said the opposite. He said, it's so exciting up here at the moment, Pamela, everybody's coming. Everybody but New Zealand. So I thought to myself, what do we need to do to raise awareness and to help people get more comfortable? I mean, I've lived in Singapore and worked across Southeast Asia as well, and I know that when you are stationed on the ground there, things do get pretty exciting. It's a lot faster, and it's very global. And I just would like to think that maybe we need to think of other ways that we can encourage people to get up there and have a taste, because clearly we're missing out on some opportunities.
Well, I think the good news is the Christopher Luxon-led government has made Southeast Asia a big focus area. The Prime Minister is up there at the moment on leading a delegation to Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines,
Mm-hmm.
and that'll be one of many. So I think both for reasons of wanting to diversify our trade base and have less reliance on China, but also because there are significant opportunities in those markets. We'll see a bit more focus on that, and I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah. Now, your business, EMA, Employees and Manufacturers Association, is a co-owner of Export New Zealand. So you're very actively involved in running that organisation. Is that correct?
We are. We have about 1,000 exporters amongst our almost 7,000 members. The Export Institute, as it was originally, later became Export New Zealand, was formed in the early 1970s when New Zealand realised we had to diversify away from the UK because they were entering the European Economic Community as it was then. So we work very closely with exporters, typically at the entry level as people are starting to think about export or are just in that early stage. And in the New Zealand system, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise tend to work with the more developed exporters. We still have a lot of those big companies like Fonterra and Zespri as members of ours, but the real nitty-gritty work we do tends to be with smaller exporters.
And which industries do you see are progressing into the export markets more than others?
Well, there's some really interesting opportunities, I think. A lot of development in the nutraceuticals and cosmetics space. We typically, you've got a lot of New Zealand business who are taking extracts of other products, be it seaweed, be it proteins, be it in some cases extracts out of trees, and developing those. Always a lot of opportunities in niche food, and again particularly in supplements, but increasingly in niche foods, things like dairy, goat, sheep cheese, and then New Zealand manufacturing economy is much bigger than most people realise. And a lot of those manufacturers operate in niches. So the recent Indian Moonlander had two key component parts in it, supplied by Raycon and Rocket Lab. And a lot of New Zealand manufacturers are part of those Asia Pacific supply chains. So you don't necessarily see their brand on the final product, but you definitely see their componentry made up in it, whether that's hardware or software.
Yes, now that point about New Zealand innovation, today's news, there was an article of an interview with NZTE. Is it Murphy, Mr. Murphy?
Glenn Murphy. I was just talking to him about an hour and a half ago.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
Well, he was reported today in saying that in Australia, the New Zealand technology companies are doing a very good job. And in the 4 years he's been in that role, they've doubled in terms of the number of technology companies that have gone to Australia. And apparently his view is that Australians see New Zealand as very innovative. It's a shame that not more of us see ourselves that way, so that we haven't got the confidence to get offshore.
Yeah, look, I think one of the challenges always for our companies is they tend to be pretty small. And so NZTE and ourselves and other organisations play a pretty important role in trying to help them to scale and enter a market. My observation from the last few years, and I've been on the boards of a couple of early stage companies that have been successful in Australia, is there really is a great ecosystem in Australia. It's developed particularly over the last 10 years, I think, and so getting those companies in market. There are differences for sure in Australia compared to New Zealand, but there's definitely much more harmonisation between the two countries economically than there is with anyone else.
And so what's your advice to businesses when they come to Export New Zealand and say, how do we get into Australia? How do we get into Malaysia, Singapore? What are the sort of core things that you promote to them that they must do to be successful there?
I think partnerships are really key. And whether you're going into a market in your own right and establishing partners with maybe suppliers and advisors, or whether you're going into a market with, to find a distributor, I think those partnerships are key. And my advice is go slow to go fast.
Mm-hmm.
Take the time to get the right partner. Spend some time doing your due diligence, and understanding what their track record is. I think often because our companies are small, if someone's keen to work with us, then they're very keen to work with them. But my advice is go slow, do your due diligence, really, really understand, how partnering goes. Think of the worst thing that could go wrong in your partnership and whether this partner, how this partner would respond in that situation, and that'll give you a good clue as to whether the partnership will go well or not. And then once you've found the right partner or the right set of advisors to help you, then there should be plenty of assistance in market to help. And don't do the other thing New Zealand companies do. Don't be a lone ranger. Go and talk to other New Zealand businesses, even if they're competitors, and just find out what their market experience has been like, so that you take advantage of that scar tissue that quite frequently exists in your sector, but that you might not have tapped into.
Brett, as well as I do, that the cultures are very different in terms of the day-to-day operations of working in Australia versus working in New Zealand. And I've been in Australia since 2005. It's a long time. But when I first arrived there, I was also in a state of shock, having come down from the Northern Hemisphere, thinking it was a bit like coming home. But it wasn't. It's so very different. I think New Zealanders going into Australia find it very competitive and fast and aggressive, and Australians coming to New Zealand find it a bit slow and a bit villagey, and a bit sort of complacent. People are a bit ho-hum about things. So how do you address those challenges? Because they're vastly different business cultures, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think, New Zealand, it's hard to get a fast no. People are very polite. I think our passive aggressive culture is sometimes the thing that I dislike about New Zealand. But we are a small village, and people are often concerned about offending people, and particularly if it's been a contact that's come from somebody else. They're worried about damaging relationships, where, as I like to say, personal relationships are over there and business is over there. And while there's an intersection, you've got to be able to be objective. So I think I'm always searching for more fast no's in New Zealand. Australia, you don't have a problem getting a fast no or a fast yes. But if you get a fast yes, you better be prepared to deliver, because Australian companies will not tolerate poor delivery. It's a very competitive market, and Australian business people are very direct. So if you commit, be prepared to step up to that commitment, and be prepared that if you don't deliver, then there will be consequences. So I think that is the reality, I think, for New Zealand companies going into Australia. But I think it's a good reality, because ultimately I think if Australia is your first step into export, you're going to get some really good disciplines from being in that market that are going to serve you well in other places.
That's a really good point. It's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of Kiwis will skip over Australia and go straight to Europe for their holidays, or the US for their holidays. And I think they see sometimes that Australia's too close, and maybe it's all just the same. So therefore, they sort of don't have that experience of going there for their holidays and getting to understand a little bit about that culture. And I think one of the things about working in 2024 and beyond is that we all need to learn or be more skillful at understanding what it's like to sit in the place, or stand in the seat of the person that's coming from another culture, because both New Zealand and Australia are very multicultural now in terms of workforces, and so we have to get better at being more inclusive of different cultures, and therefore just focus less on the differences and focus more on the business outcomes that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you take one of the big trade opportunities for New Zealand at the moment is India. And I think there's a lot to learn from how Australia engage with India. They leverage the Indian diaspora in Australia, both at a corporate level and at an individual level, and they really built those relationships. And so the multicultural nature of the two societies on either side of the Tasman actually gives us a huge advantage if we want to take it, if we want to really tap into other countries, and I think the same would apply for Southeast Asia, where we have a lot of diaspora from Southeast Asia in New Zealand and Australia, and a lot of and a lot back in those countries that still have very fond memories of maybe doing their formal education in New Zealand and Australia.
Does your organisation provide support, cultural learning, training through your sort of development programs? Is that something you offer?
Well, we do a little bit of it, but I think there are a lot more opportunities. I often get asked, because I've been in international business for so long, by members, "Hey, look, I'm going into this market. What would you, how would you advise me?" I know it's something NZTE do, but often I say to them, go and talk to people in your local community. If you're going off to work in India, go and talk to some people in your local community, or point them to some local Indian businesses who can just give you some real guidance about how to operate. So there's really no excuse for not networking these days. We've got lots of apps and lots of ways, and organisations like ours that can connect people, and I think that can be a really good way of making sure that you don't go into a market blind.
Yeah, I think a lot of Southeast Asia is very welcoming to New Zealand and Australian businesses. They speak, most of them speak very good English and have got experience in working with Australian and New Zealand companies, and they feel at ease with them. Like you, my advice would also be to get on the phone and dial up for a Zoom, ask for a Zoom call, have the conversations, and don't be frightened to knock on doors. It's one of the things that, over time you can get to speak to anybody if you ask. So you just get comfortable with it.
I think culturally we both cultures are seen as being pretty straight up. I think one of the challenges for New Zealand is there are dimensions to our economy which are not obvious from the outside. Most people know that it's a beautiful place to visit because they've seen the images. They know that we produce agricultural products because that's what we're famous for. But there's many other sectors in New Zealand where we have capability. And I know we're trying very hard through initiatives like New Zealand Story and through the work that we do to make sure that we don't just showcase the obvious parts of New Zealand, but we show those dimensions. Who knew that last year the country that launched the fourth most rockets into the world was New Zealand? And probably a lot of people globally don't know that story.
It's a great story, isn't it? I also read this week that Wellington and Marlborough airports are going to trial a electric plane for delivering regional post, which is a great initiative, isn't it? To be successful at that, in New Zealand, that could change the economics and the profitability and productivity of our aviation industry.
Yeah, and I think over the years, there's been a lot of international tech firms have used New Zealand as a test bed. I mean, we've seen a number of the big US firms and also firms out of Asia, using New Zealand. It's a very multicultural market. If you're putting things in the air, we don't have a lot of plane movements, and it tends to be fairly short distances between locations. So there are a lot of things that make New Zealand a pretty good test bed in that way, and it's a good opportunity for our local technology community to work with innovators from other countries.
What would you say is the appeal for Australian workers to come to New Zealand? What would you, what does New Zealand, Export Business New Zealand and your organisation, what are your messages to foreign workers, particularly Australians, to say, come to New Zealand because, what can we offer them?
Well, I think the lifestyle is pretty good, and that's certainly what drew me back to New Zealand, having worked offshore for a long time, including living in Australia. So I think there is great lifestyle. Not to say there isn't great lifestyle in Australia, but there's a different kind of lifestyle here. We actually have seasons of the year, which is not something that happens in every Australian capital city. And I think also there is I think there is probably a greater innovation intensity in New Zealand. Australia is blessed with the fact that it, has so many minerals and the resources sector
Natural
is so
resources.
big.
Yes.
Um, I lived and worked in Western Australia for 3 years, and I didn't meet many innovative companies there that weren't involved in resources.
Yeah.
So I think we've got quite a tight innovation system here, Crown Research Institutes, universities, funders, and incubators. So often when in the past when I've hosted people, whether it's been from Australia or elsewhere, they've been quite impressed about how connected that system is, and the fact that it is a good place to incubate ideas. And again, I don't think we tell that story enough.
That's right. I think if you go back to the Hamilton jet, and the number 8 wire, we've got some great stories that go back many, many years. And sometimes you think that we're just, Kiwis are just a bit what's the word? Take a lot for granted, and we don't want to beat our chest.
Yeah,
probably do that better.
I think that's right, Pamela. I think because we're small, we often believe we're inferior, and yet, when I've hosted delegations from overseas, particularly in that innovation space, they've been amazed at how connected our system is. So, I often say small should be our superpower as a country, and when we get that right, take the space industry where we built a space agency and a space industry over the period of about 5 years, we can really do it well. We've done similar things in our screen sector. So it's definitely possible, but it just requires a lot of focus and probably us to often drive outside of our comfort zone, because moving at that kind of pace is often seen as risky here. We can be a bit conservative.
Now, that all sounds really positive. However, my first venture back to Auckland after being away for decades, it was about 5 years ago, and I remember standing on the 20th floor of a harbour edge building looking down over the port, and I said to my host, "Why is the port still here?" Because I'd remembered that 2 decades earlier we talked about moving the port. It's still there, and we still have these debates about the infrastructure challenges of moving some of it to Tauranga or to Whangarei, etc. So there is this, while we've got a great sense of innovation and opportunity to, ratchet up the exports to Australia and to Asia, that we have these sort of internal challenges. What do you think the new government might be able to do to help with that? And do you think that the cultural impediments are too great for a government to be able to shift the dial on these big infrastructure projects that never get completed?
There's a bit to unpack in all of that, but let me give it a go. Firstly, I think because we are small and we are quite risk averse, in particularly in the public sector, I think that results in a lot of procrastination, and because infrastructure has tended to be weaponized politically, we're going to build a road, we're not going to build a road, we're going to build a railway, we're not going to build a railway. So I think we need a consistent bipartisan approach, at government level, central and local, that if we say we're going to do something, we're going to get on and do it. I also think I'm old enough to have been around, and I actually worked in the last part of the Muldoon government, who had their now infamous think big approach, which, for those not familiar with it, was basically New Zealand's decision to invest in a whole bunch of infrastructure and projects to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels after the oil shocks in the 70s. Now, some of those projects didn't go so well, some of them did. And I would argue at the time, it was not so much that they were the wrong projects, it was just that we got the risk weighting wrong between the private sector and the public sector. In other words, the New Zealand government took so much risk. So I think we went from thinking big to thinking small. And I think there has been a sort of an intergenerational kind of fear that we couldn't make those big calls. So I would say to the government, and I think they're definitely alert to this, you can make those big calls, but you can make those big calls eyes and ears wide open, because we've got partners. We can go to Australia and see the very best and the very worst of infrastructure projects. Similarly in Asia. And we can find those partners to help us. And I think when I talk to senior ministers in the government across the three coalition parties, I think they all recognise that we need to bring in more partners, and we need to create the right risk and reward environment for getting them involved. We've got a fantastic track record over our European history in New Zealand of building some amazing infrastructure. So we just need to get back to that level of courageousness. Having said that, it did help the fact that the UK banks wrote off the debt in the early 1900s of some of the major projects that probably might not have passed muster from a business case point of view if they were put up now.
Yeah. So with regard to the port, I think there has been a recent recommendation that they sell some of that, lease it to a private enterprise. Is that going to be something that's going to be good for Auckland business?
Look, it's certainly something that the EMA, we've pushed for. We think that a lot of the local government and central government balance sheets could benefit from an injection of the private sector. When John Key was a Prime Minister here, there was a lot of controversy about selling down some of the power companies into partial private ownership. Those power companies have only continued to do well. So, yeah, I think again we had a stage in the 1980s where, as we deregulated the economy, we privatised a lot of assets. And we've learned some lessons from that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look to have private involvement, whether it's in ownership or management. So I would definitely support that for the port, and I would support that for a number of other assets that I think would be run better by the private sector and generate better returns for ratepayers and taxpayers.
Okay, the EMA, you've been there for what, 5, 6, 7 years, a fair while, right through COVID. Can you share with us what your observations have been about how businesses have been responding to the quickening pace of change, the need to digitize everything, hybrid working, all of these sort of practical things? I think when we did the briefing for this, you suggested that you had noticed some quite substantial changes in the workforce that you thought were going to be challenging for the future.
Yeah, look, I think the job of a CEO has never been so demanding. I've been in a CEO seat for, I think, the best part of 17 years, and I think the usual cliches apply. Change is a constant, but this is change at a pace that I don't think we've ever seen before.
Yes.
I think we saw a lot of disruption going on with technology pre-COVID. I think COVID advanced some of that. It changed our habits of working. So we have now a generation of workers who are okay with the idea of not being in a physical office every day of the week. And I think those things present some interesting productivity opportunities for businesses, but also create some cultural challenges as well. And then I think specifically to Auckland and New Zealand, and probably Auckland more specifically, I think unfortunately the number of COVID lockdowns that we had and just the pressure of that change has created quite a fragile people environment. I talk about Auckland having universal PTSD. I think as a result of COVID, I think people are still, it was a pretty stressful time. And so I think that puts a lot of pressure on senior managers to, in their engagement with staff. And I think people expect a lot more one-on-one interaction than they've done before, which is not an unreasonable thing, but it's incredibly time-consuming if you're a smaller enterprise where someone who's a manager is likely to be, involved in some business activity themselves, as well as managing people. And we find our services that we provide to our members get called on a lot more, than ever before, because people need that help in dealing with issues.
What does this PTSD that you refer to look like? What are you seeing that you feel is a ongoing manifestation of the changes that we've had to face over the 4 years?
Yeah, I think firstly, people expect to have a lot more one-on-one time in the organisation that they're in. So it's not about being managed as part of a team; it's being about managed as an individual.
Mm,
I think some of what we saw with COVID, coupled with the downturn we've gone through, people are very money conscious.
mm,
And so there's a lot more out of cycle discussions about pay. There's pay relativities are really important to people, and it's quite a touchy issue. And so therefore we're seeing a lot more mobility in the labour market. In New Zealand, there's been a shortage of skilled workers, so there's been a bit of that. I think also people looking for greener pastures, having been locked down in Auckland for the best part of a couple of years. A lot of young people are venturing offshore, many to Australia, and I've seen that with some of my own staff, but also further afield. So it's just created a lot more disruption in the workforce, and even where people, have had a lot of time and investment go into their careers with organisations, nevertheless, they're still saying, look, that was great. Actually, probably what I would have expected anyway, because, and thank you, but now I'm heading off to do something else. So businesses are having to rethink the employee life cycle within their organizations and rethink just how to get all of that stuff into the right balance.
mm. No, that's interesting. I mean, New Zealand has always felt disadvantaged because of the brain drain. Kiwis get up at some stage between the age of 20 and 30, head off to Europe, do their few years.
Mm.
Some come back, but a lot don't. I remember very, very clearly some KPMG partners saying to me, Pamela, you're amazing. There's just one thing that's missing, which is overseas experience. That one sentence hounded me for a long time until I got the ticket and left. Now,
At least you came back, Pamela.
you might want people just to go for 3 to 5 years, but I was gone 20 years. That's 2 decades. I'm back now, I've still got a foot in Australia, and I'm working here in New Zealand as well. But sometimes I say to people, be careful what you wish for, because
Completely.
we do lose a lot and they never come back at all. When I was in Australia, I wrote a book called Stepping Up. I interviewed a lot of Australians who are working in Asia. Many of them said they would not come back to Australia until they retired. They tried to come back, but when they tried to come back, they couldn't get into the level or or get the respect or the earnings that they were able to get in Asia. So after 2 years of being back in Australia, they went back to Hong Kong, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and they just said, forget it, we're not coming back until we retire because it's too much of a backward step. So the longer people stay away, the harder it is to return.
Yep.
However, when people do come back, they do feel disadvantaged, and then we've got to look after them and make them feel welcome. Otherwise, they will just get up and leave again. So on that sort of conversation which you kicked off, which is that the nature of people in the workplace has changed, and they want more individual one-on-one coaching, training, mentoring. And of course, you referred to this as a PTSD, as a result of PTSD, the result of COVID. They're a little bit more requiring more support. How do we juggle all this huge demand and try and keep our best and attract our best to come back?
Yeah, look, I think it is the challenge of the day. I really do. I think it is about, one, recognizing that people need to be managed as individuals. Secondly, understanding that the investment that is required to keep them, but also being realistic that the days of people staying even for 3 years now, I think, is becoming less and less likely. So you probably need to just rethink your succession planning and how you bring people on. And then be effectively saying to yourself, how do I get the best out of that person for the longest period of time, without necessarily thinking they're going to stay forever. That won't be the same for all businesses, and certainly maybe if you're larger businesses where you can offer people more career opportunity, then you might be able to keep them. But I think if you're a small or medium enterprise, it's much harder to do that. So I think I say to people, you've just got to spend the time with people and certainly anticipate issues early. If you've got a sense that maybe something's not right, someone's not really happy, get in there fast and engage with them, because otherwise next minute they're gone and you're left wondering, hey, what could I have done that might have kept that person here a little bit longer in that process.
Do you think we're taking advantage of the mobile working and the ability to tap into talent from all around the world using technology to bring them in as part of our team? Why do we need to be only focus in on either Australia or New Zealand for our workforces when we could be tapping into staff from Asia or Europe or America?
Look, it's a great question. I'm on the APEC Business Advisory Council. I'm one of New Zealand's 3 reps on there, and there we've been talking about, a high skills visa, which basically, or if you like, the ability, if you've got high skills, to move without a visa between countries in APEC, so that you're not brain draining each other. You're effectively creating a common pool in the Asia Pacific of people that can be moving around easily between places. To your point, it doesn't necessarily have to be physically moving. You might be able to do that electronically. But I think we've got to get much smarter in that space. There will always be a shortage of skills. We're never going to catch up. Technology is moving too fast for us ever to get in front of that. That ship sailed many, many years ago. Instead, I think we've just got to get smarter about that flexibility, and recognise that in the gig economy, people are going to move from gig to gig, and we just need to make it, find ways of making that work, and also normalising it in the workplace, so people don't, sort of fear or feel unhappy about people sort of coming in and then leaving a business, because quite often it's disruptive for the people that don't want to do that. So just making them understand, hey, it's cool. That person's coming in because they've got a particular set of skills, but they're not going to be coming in for a long period of time. So just accept that and, make the most of that opportunity to try and take advantage of the skills while they're there.
Yes, I do think that, we learned through COVID that we could work very effectively virtually. I don't think we've got comfort yet in being able to reach out to people from other countries to come and work on our projects. Some have, and I've met quite a few who've done that, and it's a different culture, and it's a very they built a competency in being able to work virtually with multicultural people who they've never seen that live in other countries. But it's a huge opportunity for accessing talent, and as you say, being more acceptable of the gig economy and being open to that kind of way going forward, because I think the world is changing so fast now that if we don't start to build these new capabilities and get comfortable with being very different about the way we do business.
Well, if you look at, I'm an advisor to Tata Consultancy Services, and if you look at how some of those large technology companies, whether it's Tata or IBM or others, have developed over a period of time, it's because they've had workforces in different time zones, and they've been able to leverage those time zones. They've been able to leverage those capability bases at scale, and that's enabled them to build enormous businesses. I would argue that you could use the same process, but you could do that as a small business by working with gig workers in different countries. It's certainly not a new thing, but it's never been done. It's never become uniform or normative in that small and medium enterprise space.
Yes. Now, Brett, the last question I ask everybody on the Thrive 2030 interviews is this: as a CEO, if you found your next CEO role being the CEO of the world, what would be on your 100-day list?
Wow. Well, I think if I was CEO of the world, I would find a way of creating a better forum for resolving issues, because I think the world has become very good at talking past each other. So I think I'd find a way of, some forums and some methods for dealing with issues more, in a simpler way.
Mm.
But I think also
Okay.
I would prioritise climate, because it's the existential crisis that we're all facing. I think there are pan-national multilateral solutions to that. That's going to require, again, us to put some of our self-interest aside,
Mm-hmm.
and actually work more collectively to do that. So if we can find the forum to do that, and we can focus on climate, which, by the way, has lots of other benefits, then I think we could be a little more confident that future generations aren't going to be dealing with a very difficult legacy that we've left behind for them.
Yeah, great answers. I love that. Thank you, Brett. Very insightful. And thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I know you have been flying in and out from Geneva. Was it Geneva you were in last week?
I was.
So thanks for squeezing us in and having this very insightful conversation about the opportunities between Australia and New Zealand, and between New Zealand and Asia. And it's been really terrific to have your time today. Thank you so much, Brett.
Thanks, Pamela.
All right, take care.